It is Friday, September 20th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another PS1 Gray style episode of LTPS. We have a lot to go over. There is still so much going on in the PlayStation landscape, so let's begin, as always, with a very brief reminder for the PS Plus Essential September lineup, which is still live on PSN, and also we can mention PS Plus Extra and Premium. Those lineups are now live on PSN as well, and that also means we now have some games that are going to be exiting the game catalog on October 15th, kind of dead set in the middle there, which we have 10 titles in total leaving, and it's primarily a lot of Dragon Quest games, that being Builders, both Builders, and then Heroes and Heroes 2, Echoes of an Elusive Age, and then you've also got Evil Within, Ultra Street Fighter 4, Gotham Knights, kind of a whatever game, but still something where you probably would want to play it via subscription instead of buying it, and then LBP3, another SIE title as well, which, I suspected with Forbidden West, it's going to be something where probably more SIE games are going to cycle out when they don't necessarily have to, because that is the byproduct of subscription, where they take things out that they already own just to cycle them back in and then sort of reinvigorate subscription numbers for those that are maybe leaving the service or still not sure if they want to jump back in or whatever the case is. But I will say Dragon Quest, those games, 50, 100 plus hours, so you want to start those right now if you are even mildly interested in those games, if you do end up liking them. And what we can also say for the classic games as well, so Mr. Mosquito, Sky Gunner, and Secret Agent Clank, those all did launch with trophies, and the Time Splitter games, all three of those did end up getting their trophy patches recently as well, so it's been something where, again, it's a slow rollout, but I am really loving how we're adding niche titles, games that I was not expecting, games that are very expensive with a physical print, some of these cool PSP entries, and of course games that maybe they don't get trophies right away, but they do seem to get them shortly after. So it's really encouraging to see that despite the slow progress, it is getting better and better over time. All right, moving on to our first news story, let's talk about Sony's recent new announcements for their 30th anniversary plans, which, so far the plans have been kind of muted, just offering, game soundtracks on Spotify, which is, cool, or the very avant-garde toys with the Shapes of Play collection. So far, it's like, okay, I really hope you're going to say more. And they have, which it is something that we were all hoping would be the case. And it is. PS1 themed PlayStation 5 consoles and accessories. It's the full suite. It really does look incredible. So here's the details, because there's actually a lot to unpack here. There's going to be a PS5 Pro PS1 style console, and that is going to include not just the console, but also a 30th anniversary standard DualSense and DualSense Edge, and a 30th anniversary charging stand, and a matching gray console cover if you do decide to add a disk drive later. It also comes with a very cool PS1 style USB-C connector, and then 4 PlayStation-shaped cable ties, a PlayStation sticker, a limited edition poster, which that's one of 30 possible designs, so it's a little bit of a gotcha mechanic going on there. You're not exactly guaranteed a certain design, but there's going to be 30 available. And then also a PlayStation paperclip, which is very bizarre. But the PS5 Pro is going to be limited to 12,300 units, which is, of course, a nod to the PS1's original launch date in Japan, December 3rd. Now, the regular digital edition console that they're going to offer as well, that comes with a DualSense, a matching DualSense, and also a matching console cover for the disk drive as well, and all the other smaller goodies that the Pro has in addition. This model does not appear to be in any sort of limited capacity, so you are probably going to have an easier time getting this versus, say, the PS5 Pro bundle, I should say. Now, the 30th Anniversary Edge, Standard DualSense, and the Portal, those are all going to be offered standalone as well, so the entire collection is going to launch on November 21st. Pre-orders begin September 26th on PS Direct, and they will require a PSN ID, so there is going to be a slightly higher barrier of entry, but I would safely assume we are probably going to see another 2020, PS Direct landing page where you have to wait in queue, so those nightmares are certainly going to return here. If you do live somewhere without PS Direct, though, then pre-orders are going to begin again on the 26th, but that's going to be for participating retailers. And then the digital edition console and standard DualSense, those are going to be available at third-party retailers overall, so even if you have PS Direct, you can get those at your Walmart, Target, Best Buy, things like that. Pre-orders are going to begin October 10th for the console and September 26th for the controller. So a few options, but the PS5 Pro the PlayStation Portal and the Edge, those are only going to be on PS Direct if you live somewhere with PlayStation Direct. So how do we feel about these? I'll tell you, they do look gorgeous. These things, I think, are pretty much exactly what people were expecting and hoping for the 30th anniversary. It's really the 20th anniversary PS4 console and then some, because I didn't think they would do all these additional accessories, that being the Edge and the Portal. So it's great, and they are offering the Portal standalone, the Edge standalone, of course the controllers, so it's really cool. My problem here, two problems, and it's unsurprisingly a price thing, which is these things are going to be expensive, more so than probably standard machines, because quite frankly, they're throwing in more goodies. That, and also they can just easily sort of get away with what is a special 30th anniversary console. So even in the case of like the standard MSRP $450 for a digital edition PS5, I would expect this thing's probably going to be an even $500. And then the Pro, I mean, they're throwing a lot into that bundle. You're talking about an Edge, standard DualSense, the charging stand. That's going to be a very big bundle. It's going to be easily $1,000 or something like that, which even that is not necessarily going to be a deterrent from that thing selling out almost immediately, but it's going to be a lot of money. The problem is that, you know, this is the one console out of PlayStation history where they actually didn't necessarily have to do that, because these things are, you know, you could take the covers off, right? Like, that's the cool thing about these consoles, is that you can swap out the covers and put something else on there, and they're not offering those separately. This very much is paywalled behind the consoles straight up, which it's kind of annoying, right? Because there's still, you know, a sort of a je ne sais quoi to buying the consoles outright if you do say want to do that versus the covers, because the retail box is going to be designed just like they were with the PS1 back in the day at retail, which I love that touch. It looks gorgeous, especially for, you know, psychos that like to keep console boxes, which is absolutely me. I got plenty of them. So there's that. Also, the little 30th anniversary nods and references on the consoles, on the portions of the console that are not the covers, because I think you can see in between the sort of accenting black underline for the digital edition, you could see a 30th anniversary logo there. So there's little, you know, nods and hints everywhere for the if you do buy the console straight up. But these things are just going to be really expensive, and they did not have to paywall them straight up behind the consoles. You could have just offered the covers as well. But it is more than I thought they would do. I thought the best case scenario here was going to be just console covers and the DualSense, but to offer an Edge, the PlayStation Portal, this crazy mega PS5 Pro bundle, I'm not going to front. It does look absolutely gorgeous, and it does speak to those that are really nostalgic for the PlayStation PS1 gray design that we saw with the PS4 20th Anniversary Edition. All right, let's move on to the latest PlayStation 5 system software update that recently went out, because it seems like this update is causing some problems for those playing Final Fantasy XVI right now, where some people are playing the game and running into some serious graphical artifacts popping up on screen, or the game is just straight up crashing. And I'm even seeing some reports from Does It Play that some people with PS5 Slim consoles are running into issues with their detachable disk drive, to where it had to update and re-authenticate, and now the disk drive can't read disks anymore. That seems to be a much more isolated issue, but it was widespread enough for Final Fantasy XVI to where Square had to acknowledge it. They are aware of the issue, and they're also talking with SIE about the problem as well. Now, I'm fairly certain this did happen prior with the firmware update on PlayStation 5, where it messed up. I want to say it was another Square game, if I remember correctly. So this is not like a new thing. It's definitely happened before, where a new firmware went out and it actually did disrupt gameplay for maybe a handful of titles, or I think it was a Square one, but we're probably going to either get a hotfix or just a straight up minor incremental firmware to address these problems, since it does seem like the game was not obviously the issue here. So if you were running into this, then just know that Square and Sony are looking into the issue. Hopefully this will be addressed sooner rather than later. Now, while we're on the topic of Square and Final Fantasy XVI, we can move on to our next story, which is the sort of eventual confirmation finally that yes, these games did underperform and they did not meet their sales goals, coming directly from Square, where this was posted on their main site. It was from a financial briefing that took place in May, but was only recently published. And so this is coming from Square's president, Takashi Kiryu, where they outright state, and I quote here, "In the HD games sub-segment, we released multiple new titles, including major titles such as Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but profits unfortunately did not meet our expectations." So again, really important to remember, this briefing was back in May, but it was only recently published this past week, which does tell us a few things. Number one, that means with Rebirth coming out in January and this being in May, that sort of implies that that game did not really do well right out the gate, with it not really having that much time on the market. And that sort of goes right into the sort of long-standing thing with Square of how these games on paper may do millions of units and they seem to sell well, but then Square shows up and says, it didn't really do what we were looking to do. But the subtext there is always if they can take that millions of dollars and put it in the stock market for an 8% return on average versus, say, 5% with these games or something, like that's the core issue. So there's that. Then with 16, the game was already out for a little bit more at that point, so we can now see that when 16 came out, the game did initially do very well. They felt confident about it, saying that, it sold 3 million and so amount of time. I forget what the metric was, but usually if they come out and say, thanks, and here's a number that we're throwing out there, they want to be, proud about it and generate more interest in the franchise and things like that. So it sounds like the game did not have the sales legs they were hoping it would have, which was really part of the long-term roadmap for that game. So it seems like the sales, which always fall off a cliff initially, they did not really level out to where they wanted it to level out, which is also, in a way really disappointing because I really love 16 and that game does represent something that is trying to acknowledge the many core issues that people are now discussing with Square and their games, and namely Final Fantasy as a property, which is maybe Final Fantasy is just simply not that big anymore because, it's a matter of like, okay, you ship on PC day and date. I'm sure that would help. We all know Xbox, that would be a small little bump, but it would be just that, very small, right? So exclusivity is not usually the thing that's keeping these games from doing really well nowadays. Shipping on Nintendo would certainly, I think, have a lot more mileage in that department, but it's really a case of, is Final Fantasy really a big name anymore that people love, respect, and they look forward to? It seems like that's not really what's going on with this franchise at this point in time. There's some arguments that maybe the remake series came too late, or it shouldn't be a trilogy, or that 16 just being called 16 was prohibitive to those that still feel inclined to play the first entries before getting to 16, not knowing they're all these separate self-contained stories. But that's what's, I guess, disappointing for me, is that I felt like 16, regardless if you liked it or not, they attempted to do what was being criticized, which is reinvent Final Fantasy, and that, maybe did okay initially, but not quite what Square was hoping it would be in the long run. So it's disappointing, I would say, and hopefully Square can turn the ship around, which they're now committed to multi-platform, and maybe that will jive much better for them as they go into the future and what they plan on doing for the franchise. All right, let's move on to the ESRB. That would be our video game rating system here in North America, where they've been very busy recently. First by rating LEGO Horizon Adventures, which it is an E for everyone, except the word ass is heard in the game. So just keep that in mind in case you're a little sensitive to some derrieres being referenced. But the actual news here is that the game being rated does imply it's probably going to come out very soon. And as a reminder, we had the PlayStation.com homepage listing where the game showed a November 14th release, and then they took it down. So that probably is around when the game is going to come out. And since we have a state of play coming up very soon, probably when they're going to confirm that, or maybe somewhere around that time, but conceivably we're not far away from that being confirmed. The real news here with the ESRB is that we also had a separate listing pop up for Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered. Now, of course, the ESRB does not rate games that do not exist, so now it is official. Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered is a very real thing and probably will be confirmed very soon as well. Now, longtime viewers of LTPS know this was already leaked about 2 years ago now at this point. It popped up on the XDev leak where it was there on plain view. It was something where Guerrilla was listed as the studio. Now, they might be doing this in collaboration with somebody, but I think they're probably, it's likely something where it's just purely those at Guerrilla are working on the game, maybe a smaller separate team, a bunch of new staff or something, since, well, we'll talk about that in a minute here, but the game is probably going to come out very soon. So before actually touching on that, we should also maybe go into our next news story, which is there's another remaster potentially in the pipeline, and it's sounding like that might be days gone. So initially this happened where we had Jeff Grubb, Giant Bomb's Jeff Grubb, talking during a Game Mess Mornings episode, and he mentioned that there is another remaster in the works that's going to be what he referred to as less exciting. And then the following day, we're hearing from VGC's Jordan Midler, based on this exchange on Twitter, that the game he's heavily implying is probably days gone. He's referring to how John Garvin, the former Ben creative director and the writer on that game, was upset about the Astrobot cameo that appeared in that game, and so he would probably be upset with this. So that's how it's being heavily implied here. But that's kind of where we're at. And so Jeff Grubb also recently reaffirmed that September 24th, that should indeed be the state of play. And he also kind of touched on why these remasters happen so often. So I guess that's what we can sort of get into here, which he explained, and we've had Jason Schreier talk about this before. I've heard about this as well, which is a lot of these remasters, they are a smaller team, but they're usually a great onboarding process for new team members as well. So it's one of those things where people, initially join a studio and they can get accustomed to their engine, their process, their workflow, and things like that. And certainly in between projects as well, you can have new staff work on these before they can ramp up production on maybe some of the bigger titles. And that is a very common practice with bigger studios in general, which is these, when you get up to 150 plus staff, and then we're talking let's say a range of 200 to 400 people, there is a pipeline in place where the studio is managing multiple projects at different, stages, basically, right? I mean, when one project wraps up, you can't move 300 people right into the new game. That's just simply not how it works. So typically you have a little bit of this natural flow of employees that are filtering and going into the bigger project as it ramps up production, right? That's why remasters are still a very common thing, and that's why they don't eat up as many resources as people tend to think they do. But of course, the actual real issue with this is the optics and the whole, why are they doing this? Where are the new games? It's becoming a really big perception problem with this company, and that's not to argue that it's not bad. I mean, it does look bad when you consider how everything has played out the way that it has. I mean, I would always make the counter argument of it's not as bad as it appears to be. I mean, I hate to have to be that guy, but it's like this year we had Rebirth, Helldivers 2, Astrobot, one of the best reviewed games they've ever shipped. Then, publishing projects like Stellar Blade and Rise of the Ronin. I mean, we've had a number of titles shipped this year, going against the grain of what typically has been a big problem this console cycle, which is games take forever to make. And that's still an issue Sony and everybody else is generally facing, and that's why it's so tough with game output in general from certain publishers. So it's very much a real issue, but they're navigating it in a way that does, I think, alleviate it to a degree, maybe not to a satisfactory degree, obviously. But, that combined with the fundamental issue that people, I think, still haven't really come to terms with yet. And I bring this point up a lot, but it's like they don't talk nearly as much as they used to, right? So there is that perception that there's not a whole lot going on when they don't show up to Paris Games Week, TGS, Gamescom, E3, these shows where they showed up every single year and they always said something, even though they were bringing trailers to games that we've already seen before, and we wait, 3-something years for these games to finally come out. It's weird how back then I remember the complaint so well about how it's like, oh, we saw this game again, when's it coming out? Oh, it got delayed again. Uncharted 4 saw like how many delays, and we saw the game how many times up until it finally came out. Now we're in this environment where they just don't talk and say anything up until they feel a little bit more confident that these games are going to come out. And now the argument is, well, maybe we should just go back to tell us what the game is, and we can at least know that it is coming. So it really is more of I think at this point, maybe a pick your poison kind of deal. But, that's obviously a big issue. We do have some first-party teams that are more hung up than they usually are. Media Molecule, obviously, just starting up development of a brand new game. And you have Ben that actually only started their project in 2021, since they had 2 years of, kind of working through things, the whole Uncharted story and all that stuff, right? So we can't really get into that. Naughty Dog is really our one singular example of a top-tier pillar studio, that were backed up with a live service game that ended up not actually happening. That's really the only actual single player studio that was tied up with a lot of resources into live service. And of course that is not happening anymore. So that's going to be a pretty big delay on when we're going to be expecting their next big single player game. Although I think we might actually see that sooner rather than later. But there's just a number of aspects of how we can analyze this. And then as far as the remasters that we're getting, of course, Days Gone has a movie coming up, so that's a pretty obvious PlayStation Productions tie-in. The company seems pretty committed to making sure those things show up with any sort of movie or TV show that they put out, and again, is kind of a lower resource thing compared to a brand new game. Zero Dawn, yeah, we don't need it, but they're just going to spruce the game up like Forbidden West, give it the new character models and the way that the characters move and talk and are more animated during conversation, increase foliage and draw distance, and, again, really spruce the game up. It didn't really need it, of course, but that is also the kind of scenario where you can start selling the game at $70 on PC, and I would imagine both these titles are still going to qualify for the $10 upgrade for existing owners, because that's still kind of the category they do fall in, unlike, say, Until Dawn, where that's a full-blown remake, so there is no upgrade path for that game. If it's like a Last of Us Part 2 remaster, it's probably going to be a $10 upgrade fee. Although I will call it right now, which is Zero Dawn is probably not going to be eligible if you claimed it from the Play at Home initiative back during COVID. That's a very Sony move, so I'm sure like the millions of people that have that game in their library free, not going to get $10 for the remaster, but I would love to be wrong about that. So there's definitely a very bad perception going on right now. And a lot of it is, at this point, like, earned. The company does have to, at a certain point, start controlling this narrative surrounding PlayStation in general. They can't just keep coasting on this whole, PS5 is still selling well, people are buying consoles, they're playing games, they're buying third-party games on the platform. At a certain point, you have to acknowledge this audience that you don't want to be the laughing stock of Twitter every single time you do something and have it look the way that it does, right? You really have to get a firm grip on what a large portion of the audience is doing, and they're laughing at you. You guys have got to start doing something, obviously, despite, again, what I've heard is that a lot of the first-party teams simply just do not want to say something unless they feel confident about hitting a release window. Because these games, like the ones I listed off earlier, they still fell outside of that outline that Sony already gave us, which was this fiscal year. There's not going to be any major planned sequels to existing IP, the kind of games that can do, 10, 15 million plus units. But the next fiscal year, which begins April 2025, that is going to be back to where they're shipping major first-party titles. So we already know directly from Sony, with them speaking to shareholders, which are more pertinent in this case oftentimes than customers, like they're telling people right then and there, we have big games coming out. But the question still is, what are those games? Why have you not talked about them just yet? And quite frankly, at this point, I don't know, other than you gotta assume they're gonna talk about it either by the end of this year, or let's say at the very latest, it would be that like expected early May or like near June sort of state of play showcase, whatever they end up calling these things nowadays. But there is one interesting thing we can segue into for our next news story, which is maybe a new way the company is going to be approaching, a way to fill out their portfolio, which is the recent announcement of Freedom Wars Remastered for PlayStation 5, Switch, PC. This is a very, in a way, bizarre but exciting announcement. This is a PlayStation Vita exclusive, a Sony-owned IP coming back in partnership with Bandai Namco. So this game is coming out January 10th, very soon. It includes all previous DLC. It runs at 4K 60. Online co-op is coming back as well, and it's licensed by Sony Interactive to Bandai Namco. So over on the Japanese PlayStation blog, the original director, Takeshi Tsukamoto, they explained that they always wanted to make a sequel for this game, but the opportunity never came up. But now they had an opportunity to do something with the license, and they were even asked why Bandai Namco is the publisher, despite this being a Sony-owned IP. And they say, and I quote here, when we, and Dimps is the company name here, when we, Dimps, received the license from Sony Interactive Entertainment to create a remastered version and we were looking for a publisher, Bandai Namco Entertainment kindly stepped forward and offered to publish. Now, this actually also dials back to a rumor nearly a year ago on Reset Era, where one user claimed Sony was scaling back their games as a service, and that Sega and Bandai are working on Sony IP, and they even went as far as teasing Sega as working on Wipeout as well. which the time in which that poster put that stuff out there, that was around, The Last of Us Online being canceled, a lot of the multiple layoffs and other projects being canceled. So very much they were right about that, where they've already sort of culled the portfolio to a degree where they scaled back some of the projects that they felt were likely not going to work out. But it would appear as though Sony is doing something unusual, which is they're licensing out their IP. Now, they're not, the way that we're hearing this from Dimps, from Tsukamoto there, is that they gave the IP to the studio, and it was up to the studio to figure out where they can find a publishing partner. And from that point on, they were allowed to find somebody to foot the rest of the bill. Bandai Namco stepped in, and they're the ones that are also going to publish this on, PlayStation, Steam, Nintendo Switch as well. So this is our third SIE game that will now be on Nintendo Switch, since we had MLB and Lego Horizon. So it's a very different landscape nowadays, and one that, with the context of this particular game, makes a lot of sense. Freedom Wars was a PlayStation Vita exclusive, a very cool game, by the way. We've actually we've looked at this game for some of the last years where we did PlayStation Vita Online, so that was before the online servers actually shut down for that game. But it's kind of like a weird, like, Monster Hunter-esque gameplay loop, but you're like a prisoner that has like almost no freedoms, but as you start to take down enemies, you reduce your sentence. And so it's a really cool game, and one that was, stuck on the Vita for a long time. Now it's coming back remastered. That was not on my bingo sheet for this year, so to have Sony license out IP to something a little bit more obscure, maybe niche, and a game that didn't do nearly as well, and now it comes back with a much wider audience, so therefore they can get more mileage out of an IP that, in theory, this would be the kind of game that some are looking at it in light of like Astrobot coming out and having all this PlayStation IP, and people wondering, you've got all this IP, why don't you do something with it? Now, my counter argument to that is always, well, we're just talking about sheer resources at this point. You can't just license out 100-something different IP, especially when their own internal studios, like they don't have the manpower to just start firing up a bunch of remasters and ports and remakes and all that stuff for some of these dormant franchises, and certainly it's going to take a lot longer to make new entries in those games. But you can find studios to partner up with, and let's get some of those games out the door that way. And I would agree. That's how I would want them to do it. And it looks like maybe that is how they're approaching it, especially if the rumor is going to track for, say, Sega handling Wipeout as well. Even more so if those games are actually going to be multiplat, which would be very fascinating for Sony to say, like, okay, here's the license. Just find somebody, and I'm sure Sony still has a stipulation that'll say you can't ship on Xbox or something because that's Sony. But otherwise, they would just say, here's the license, do something with it. And let's get something out of it. And they're obviously going to take a cut from sales across all platforms. So I think that would be a great direction to go if we do want to humor the idea of seeing a lot of dormant PlayStation IP come back and really have another lease on life. It's cool to see Freedom Wars, of all things, on PlayStation Vita come back. And now it's like, yo, if we're doing this, let's bring back Golden Abyss, Soul Sacrifice Delta, which I would be all for. So this is maybe this is how the company is going to start approaching the portfolio in a way where there's more stopgap releases. In a way, this is how Nintendo does a lot of their releases as well. I mean, they very much ship a lot of remasters and ports from the outgoing platform. Obviously you can make arguments about no backwards compatibility and things like that, and Wii U being a console that failed more or less, so those games needed a new lease on life. But I think you get my point, right? I mean, let's take a page out of their playbook here and just start doing that. Let's find a lot of outside studios, license out some IP, and get this PlayStation IP back on the market on PS4 and PS5. Moving on to a new update for Astrobot sales, where the game is again still seemingly doing quite well. So we've got this data from Matt Piscatella of Circana over on Blue Sky, where he did confirm that across both physical and digital, Astrobot ranked number 2 in unit sales in the US up to September 7th. So not much time on the market, but does show that the game was able to do reasonably well, only being beaten by NBA. So that does bode well for Astrobot. I've said it before, I'll say it again, this game doesn't have to do like 10, 15 million plus units. It just has to make a good, sizable amount of profit on what was a very modest budget, 3-year dev cycle, a 65-person team. You know, it can be a very basic stepping stone to potentially greenlighting another Astro, and with more Astrobot games coming out, it can build that reverence and IP notoriety that, you know, some of the larger PlayStation staples had to earn throughout the years, right? I mean, oftentimes most new IP that comes out is not a knockout success right away. So Astrobot has had some time to fester, but this being the first real time that people can like pay $50 for an Astrobot game and play it in 2D, it's looking very good and very positive. Next up, we have some not so good news for Firewalk and Concord. After 2 weeks of the game being taken offline, refunds being sent out, ceasing sales immediately, and Sony saying they would explore options to bring the game back. Right now, the current update is we have a new report coming out from Kotaku where we're hearing that Firewalk's game director Ryan Ellis told staff last week that he would be stepping down and moving into a support role instead, according to 3 sources close to the change. One former employee said, and I quote here, "Ryan deeply believed in that project and bringing players together through the joy in it. Regardless of there being things that could have been done differently throughout the development, he's a good human and full of heart." Apparently, Ryan was too emotional to speak during a post-launch studio meeting, pretty much right when the game came out and it was clear the game was not doing well. Some staff are still unsure of what's going to come next. They seem to be less sure of Concord actually returning and instead being asked about pitches for exploring something different for Firewalk, maybe firing up a different project. Some think Firewalk is just going to be spun into a support studio, and then some are also expecting that yes, the studio is going to get shut down, which in that case, I guess some people at Firewalk are not even looking for new work just yet, because it's like, well, I might as well wait it out, see if I get laid off, and then take the severance package, and I'll have that before I have to go and find new work, so that would make sense. But, you know, with 2 weeks going by, they probably do have to make a decision fairly soon. I mean, this is a studio in Bellevue, Washington, with 150-something staff. With those salaries and operational costs, it is something where they are probably going to want to figure out what they're doing soon and then make a very swift decision, which at this point, I'm now coming around to the idea that, yeah, maybe Concord just is not going to come back. And what is the best outcome here? That, I think, is a more complicated question to answer, given that, well, like this was something I brought up on Click R3 with John, which is, okay, let's say you give, you know, Firewalk another shot at making a game. These are still talented people. They can make something technically sound that plays and feels good. You know, obviously Concord missed the mark on a number of areas, but these are still talented people that can make a good video game. So, and SIE does always value talent, so what do you do with that team? It's like, okay, you greenlight another project, and it takes, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, but this demon is always going to be chasing them, in that by the time they reveal another game, we all know how this is going to go down. Headlines left and right, YouTube videos left and right. The Concord team, here's their new video game, and it's like another, in a way, optics thing that the company has to reconcile with. But in this case, I mean, it's really tough. Do you really want to invest millions of dollars again into a game that, in terms of perception, is now going to be an uphill battle for even something that maybe is going to be a lot more engaging and exciting than Concord ever was? I don't know. So do you put them in a support role and just sort of let the studio be strung along for, like, I mean, a number of people that work at Firewalk, that's not really what they signed up for initially, right? I mean, you join a new studio with funding from SIE, and then they get acquired by SIE, so you feel like you have job security working on this first-person hero shooter, and, you know, that might have been a very exciting proposition, and now it's looking like I'm either going to get fired or be now supporting the other studios, and that's not really the creative work that I signed up for. So it's a really complicated thing, but in a way, I think closing the studio is a very likely option that we might end up seeing, and I would hate for that to be the case. It's either we're going to see that fairly soon, or nothing happens and we have to wait for like some kind of article from, you know, again, Kotaku or something that has sources letting us know that, okay, here's what we're doing now, which is we're a support team for SIE after maybe half the studio gets laid off or something. I mean, it's because SIE is likely not going to confirm these things directly if they don't have to. Well, layoffs, they'll say something surely, but it's just That's where we're at with Firewalk. Not looking too hot on that one, but I think the viable options are ones that are kind of grim. Moving on to some not so great news for Minecraft and PlayStation VR 1, where this is definitely more of a fringe case that does not happen often, but when it does, it is not a good look, and that is developer Mojang has confirmed via recent patch notes for the game that as of March 2025, they will no longer support the PSVR optional mode on Minecraft for PlayStation 4, and they will be removing it from the game. So they say that their ability to support it has come to an end, and that you will still be able to play the game and use your marketplace purchases, but you won't be able to use PSVR anymore. Now, the core issue here is if you bought the game digitally, which a lot of people likely did, that means if you want to keep getting new updates and your console is going to have updates turned on and there's really no way to avoid this, even if you, say, delete the game, re-download it from PSN, you'll pull the latest version, you are going to lose a portion of the game that, let's say, in theory, that's why you bought the game or that's how you primarily play the game. So one of those weird things where they're not going to, say, offer a snapshot version of the game separately as a separate launcher on PlayStation Network now, and they can still have the main Minecraft application, and that's the one that will still continue to see content updates, which that's like the fundamental issue. The PSVR option is optional. It's baked into the one singular launcher on PlayStation Network. Now, they are testing a PS5 version, but they've not said anything about PSVR 2. And if we're being frank, I can't see them ever doing a PSVR 2 version, and they are owned by Microsoft now, so they might not be willing to foot the bill for a PSVR 2 development. So I would venture a guess and say that we're not going to see PSVR support anymore. And now this also means that your only way to play the PSVR version, there is a snapshot of it on disc where there's one physical print. It has a PSVR banner on it, so that game offline you can install and play PSVR that way. But if you have the game digitally, you are going to be losing access to a mode that if you wanted to play the game that way, you will no longer be able to. So that is worth putting out there, that if you do play Minecraft on PlayStation 4, you will no longer have access on March 2025 for the PSVR mode. All right, let's get into some PlayStation 5 Pro news. We have some analysis coming in from the folks over at Digital Foundry, where this is really their bread and butter when it comes to hyper-analyzing game footage and also the performance settings for these games and what we can expect on PlayStation 5 Pro. More so than the way Sony was able to really put the message out there. So recently the folks over at Digital Foundry were handed over some very crisp footage of Rebirth, and they are saying that the game does appear to be a night and day difference, seeing a massive improvement in image quality compared to both the performance and graphics modes, thanks primarily to PSSR. Now, to summarize the coverage, and I will link it down below for those that want to watch it more thoroughly, because obviously they're going to get into more detail than I can summarize here, but there are still some noted drawbacks that haven't been fully addressed, like occasional pop-in and ghosting that can still sometimes appear. The general graphic settings seemed unchanged as well, and PSSR at times can generate artifacts every so often based on the current version that the AI is at, but it would appear to be a substantial improvement on just the sheer image quality for the game holistically. So broadly speaking, it seems like the sort of fuzziness that a lot of people were complaining about with Rebirth is addressed on the Pro, and that might be the one singular game that's the best example so far, given that we still don't have a whole lot to go on. So this does segue into our next news story, which is about Alan Wake 2, another game that for a third party is, I think, more interesting to look at here, knowing that the game on PlayStation 5, the base console, runs at a very low internal resolution of 840p, like somewhere around there, and what Remedy does is they use FSR2 to upscale it from there. And that's one of our other few examples of a current gen-only game, and it looks kind of nutty on PC. Looks very good on PlayStation 5 initially, 30 FPS, then 60 FPS came after the fact, and so Digital Foundry was analyzing the few short clips where the game showed up during the reveal. They don't have new footage here, but they were pixel counting the few frames of that particular game, and they did find that it's still the same internal resolution, but they swapped out FSR2 for what they assume is PSSR. So there was two sections where one angle of it was 60 FPS, and that's where the internal res was still at, they counted 864p, and then there's the 30 FPS mode where that one was now pixel counted up to 1260p for the again, few frames there. Now, what's interesting is that this obviously did cause a little bit of controversy in that a PS5 Pro setting for Alan Wake 2 still has a very low internal resolution. So we saw Remedy's head of communications posted on ResetEra to say that they'll drop details soon on the PS5 Pro version. They're not confirming anything right now, but they do say that it's really more about image quality that matters when this conversation is happening, right? It's more about the image quality, not necessarily the resolution. And that is where we've been trending now for a number of years, more so in the PC landscape where you have discretion in terms of what you want to actually do. So some people, if they, barring any sort of limitations on their system, they can choose to use AI upscaling or just go for native res more often than not. It really depends on what you choose to do, but that is a scenario where in recent years it makes less and less sense to go for 4K native at 60 frames. I mean, a lot of people are tending to, just opt for FSR or Intel XeSS, NVIDIA DLSS, have that come in, give you your near 4K image qualities, and then just push frames. That's very standard over there. Console, you don't really have a choice. It's up to the studio in terms of how they want to approach these games. And so Alan Wake 2 is one of those, singular examples where they choose to run the game at a very low internal resolution, and FSR 2 is the one that's doing the heavy lifting to make the game look not like dog water, basically. So in this case, we're seeing PSSR deliver some pretty good gains. So it is going to be a fascinating thing seeing this play out further when Digital Foundry is able to really analyze these games much more closely, and we can see what the internal targets are, where that number might not be nearly as important if PSSR is able to return some really good results. And the only drawbacks in the current state of where the AI is right now is that you might have a little bit of blotchy artifacts, a few frames every so often, or it doesn't clean up, maybe draw distance nearly as well. I mean, bear in mind too, this is sort of Gen 1 of PSSR, and conceivably over time, the SDK is going to see some improvements. New options are going to be available for studios. It's going to learn over time and get better and better. And going into even PlayStation 6, we could see some pretty massive gains. So actual straight resolution targets aren't going to be the be-all end-all answer in this regard. But Alan Wake 2 is one that I think a lot of eyes were on that particular game for just that low number, which on paper seems bad, obviously, and it's the same on PlayStation 5 Pro, but kind of a different story if it still looks damn good, obviously. Now, in light of the announcement for PS5 Pro and its price tag, we do have some words here from the SI CEO of the Platform Business Group, Hideaki Nishino, speaking with Nikkei, talking about PS5 Pro, and still really vouching for consoles and the viability of it in this environment where some are looking at the $700 price tag, and they are proposing, well, why not get a PC at that point, or why don't I move somewhere else? So Hideaki Nishino says, and I quote here, "I think that many mobile games have ads, and PCs are difficult to set up. With PlayStation, you can play the content you purchased as soon as you turn it on. The products are clearly displayed in the stores where you buy software, so it's an intuitive experience." So some very simple but direct words there from Nishino-san, and I could not agree more, which is consoles will always have their place. They'll always be viable and relevant for as long as they stay being consoles, which are their closed boxes, low price tag, two wires connect them to a TV and power, and you've got a very optimized UI experience that will auto-install games for you and download patches, and you have this very simple storefront where you can navigate it and buy content. Look, we can always argue all day, every day about how consoles are maybe more complex just by nature of all those things we listed off nowadays versus what they were, let's say, 20 years ago, or how PCs are actually much more user-friendly than they were 20 years ago. Both those things can be true, and they're still uneven in terms of how consoles will be cheaper and will be more intuitive. They'll always be more intuitive and easy and accessible versus PC, just by sheer fact of economies of scale, right? I mean, it's always fun watching PC build videos where it's let's try and kill a PS5 or now a PS5 Pro, which of course that's going to be a thing. but you're still never going to beat console just by the sheer fact of economies of scale. Sony's a manufacturer. They're buying these highly optimized bespoke parts, mind you, from AMD, to where they're getting certain GPU features that are either not publicly available, or it's a mix of GPU features that you can't necessarily just conjure up on a PC. Certain consumer parts, it would never work out. It simply would never pencil out. And then there's also accounting for just like game per game optimization. Console is always this closed environment, and especially with a good SDK that developers have access to for certain platforms, they can extract a lot out of the hardware. That's how you have a base PlayStation 4 where people constantly talk about how the CPU is underpowered, and it's a machine that right out the gate was just not worth getting or something for the performance you got on paper, yet we got things like the Order 1886 on it. It's you can get absolutely gorgeous, stunning games out of consoles. So they're always going to be viable, and I like that Sony still to this day will double down on the console, despite I think many business practices that people are upset with, shipping on PC, or they're doing mobile games now, and it's no, they're still very committed to PlayStation as a console. The console business is alive and well. They are committed to it, and they're going to be in it for I think a very long time. Moving on to a very big update for the ongoing Bungie-Sony drama, Sony stepping in and cleaning up Bungie financials and everything going on there. We have some really candid words here from Don McGowan, a former Bungie lawyer, where over on their personal LinkedIn, they were sharing a Kotaku article where the article was talking about, how they're going to outline some big changes for Destiny 2. And so Don was giving some very, candid thoughts here about how Bungie operates and how it should be now with Sony owning them. So he said, and I quote, "Much though it pains me to say this, it appears that Sony's inflicting some discipline on my former colleagues may have forced them to fix things that were wrong with their game. To be clear, I'm not talking about the layoffs, I'm talking about forcing them to get their head out of their asses and focus on things like implementing a method of new player acquisition, not just doing fan service for the fans in the Bungie C-suite and running the game like a business. I remember sitting there during the deal saying, do you think Sony describes this as them getting to pay $3.6 billion for them to have the right to not have no input into what Bungie does? That was exactly what a lot of people thought." Now, Don also responded to some questions on the thread there, where he was talking about how when it came to the actual talent at the studio, they were great, but the management and the executives, they were the problem. And that's what we saw during the second wave of layoffs, where a lot of the former employees, at the time now former employees, were airing out grievances with Pete Parsons and the executive management at Bungie. And Don does make an excellent point, which is, while the initial deal was on paper meant to be, you stay independent, offer live service expertise, surely Sony is going to want to have some input, but it really depends on where Bungie was financially, which it seems like they were lying about those financials and it all looking very turbulent and not very good. So that's where Sony had to then step in, which, from what we know, there were some stipulations on meeting certain financial goals, and then Sony would step in after the fact. But Don, he's really airing out some dirty laundry here, and it sounds like he was maybe very frustrated with his time at the company, much like a lot of other employees were as well. So it's still a pretty crazy thing to see this play out, and it's always really enlightening to have somebody like Don step up and just throw words out there like this, which is very, very straightforward. I would love to see more of this more often, but that is not usually the kind of that's not normally the kind of statements you want to put out there. It's not quite spiffied and tightened up and not great a PR statement, but it is certainly one that gives us some insight into what was a little bit ugly behind the scenes. Moving on to our next news story, it's another PlayStation 6 rumor, because as we discussed on Tuesday, which if you didn't see, that upload was about PS6, a major rumor being reported from Reuters, how Intel apparently were the ones that lost the contract for supplying the chipset for PlayStation 6, and so we kind of had to talk there about that. But I opened that conversation with, yes, PS5 Pro just came out, or rather was just announced, but we are halfway through the life cycle, so we are going to start seeing PlayStation 6 rumors, the very early rumors of what this console will eventually be, and around 2028. So right away, we have another PlayStation 6 rumor, this one coming from Kepler L2 over on NeoGAF. Now, Kepler is the one where we've seen they're privy to some hardware news relating to the PlayStation business. We actually saw many things from them regarding PS5 Pro, which did end up being true, namely PS5 Pro using AMD's next generation RDNA 4 RT hardware. So in this thread discussing what the price for PS6 could be, Kepler chimed in saying that there's 2 SoCs in development for next gen, which he did clarify this means for PS6. And they said they're not sure if that's for a Series SX kind of situation where one's a high-powered box, one's a lower-powered box, or if it's some kind of home console plus handheld variant, but they do suspect one of them is meant to be more affordable. So our first very early, more direct PS6 rumor, because the one we talked about on Tuesday was really more the unsurprising news of AMD did win the contract, so PlayStation 6 is going to be another AMD-powered machine. But in this case, we're hearing the possibility of 2 SoCs. Now, SoC meaning system on a chip, so there could be some sort of, again, lesser-powered box, or perhaps a different form factor that they would be needing that for. And that's where speculation could really run wild. I'm not sure if the company would approach next gen in a way that would be similar to a Series SX variant when they were already pretty open about not doing that this time around. Of course, things can change very quickly, and so in 4 years, do they really want to be in a position where, that's the discussion, is, PS5 Pro being $700, will this next console be $700 plus dollars? Again, I'll argue maybe they want to subsidize it, or they'll have to go back to the subsidy model so it won't be $700, but it will still have to be probably more than what PlayStation 5 launched at in 2020. So would it now be a different environment where they do want to offer 2 PS6 variants, or would it actually be something where Sony is going to seriously pursue the handheld environment in a way that we now have this separate handheld and a new SDK that is conducive to PS6 native games, now having a very low-powered variant of the game running on the optional hardware, if that is even remotely feasible, because that would be, I think, costly, and in that form factor in terms of thermals, would maybe be very hard to pull off. Maybe it would just be a next generation sort of remote play device that is a lot more proprietary and expensive, but it does get down the latency to where it feels very close to native play. Again, speculation can really run wild here, but we will certainly keep this in mind as we now begin PlayStation 6 coverage, which is going to be a lot of rumors up until a reveal in 2027 or something. Who knows how long it's going to be, but of course, here on Let's Talk PlayStation, we are here for the ride in covering the next major entry in mainline PlayStation consoles. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. You can follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel, a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and we had, again, the PS6 report on Tuesday about the Intel AMD contract thing, so if you missed that, then go check out what went on with that report. And then yesterday, I finally wrapped up my edit for my Astrobot Platinum playthrough. So, been a while since we did a sort of Platinum-style playthrough video, and that was now my longest video I've ever uploaded on YouTube. Full 4K 60, mostly uncompressed, right under YouTube's 256 gigabyte limit, but we got it out there pretty, I don't want to say rough, but a big supercut of my playthrough. I've got every reaction to the VIP bots in the game in there, a lot of the big bosses and cool sequences, so finally happy to get that out there. You can go watch that for anybody that really enjoys the super long Platinum style videos. And then coming up, we have probably that state of play on the 24th, so we will watch closely and see what happens. If it does pop up on Tuesday, of course, we'll show up with a reaction and impressions day of and try to get that all sorted. But otherwise, that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.